All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Corey Lawrence, and I'm coming to you live here from WeWork in downtown Washington, D.C. WeWork is our co-work sponsor for the week. We're really excited to be working out of this space as our headquarters. I am one of the organizers of DC Startup Week and also the founder of IRL Agency. DC Startup Week is a year-round organization, but we have our 5-day kind of culminating event that we do every year, every September, that focuses on building the startup community. We want to give a quick shout out to our title sponsors, Next, Insperity, WIS, and Technology Rivers. Thank you so much for making this week possible. This is our 90th event for the week. We've had 4,000 attendees. We've had 170 speakers. None of this would be possible without their support of our community. If you have any questions throughout the talk, please put in all caps question at the start of your chat. That way we don't miss any of your fantastic questions. We are so excited to have John Green moderating this panel on building a diverse tech team, even if you aren't technical. So please join me in welcoming John and our panelists to the DC Startup Week stage.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John. Corey just mentioned. I'm living in Virginia, work at Till, which is a DC startup helping, I think the line is helping renters pay, stay, and thrive in their homes. Some experience throughout the DC tech area. I've been in, startups, other companies in DC for quite a while. And then I'll leave it to Hilliary and Frankie to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll go first. My name is Hilliary Turnipseed. It's great to meet you guys on a Friday morning. Thank you for waking up with us. I am based in DC as well, and my career has been pretty much at the intersection of tech and media. I am the non-technical person on this panel, really providing everyone with more of the sort of talent acquisition, people operations perspective, and having been sort of the head of talent in-house for a variety of DC-based companies and startups, I have decided last year to go solo, go out on my own, and kind of join the ranks of other entrepreneurs here at DC Startup Week, where I started my consultancy where I am helping teams build and maintain diverse engineering teams specifically. And so really great to have you guys here. We really want this to be interactive as possible. And I will let Frankie introduce herself next as sort of the more sort of technical expert kind of on the panel too.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I know for some of you, this is probably feeling really early. It's a little early for me, but I think it builds character. So thanks for joining us today. I am Director of Engineering at ICX Media, which is a local DC-based startup. We are ad tech adjacent, big data, Google Cloud Platform data pipelines coming out of our ears. I am like a hiring manager at my startup right now, but the perspective that I hope to be bringing to you today is the fact that all of the companies that I've worked at as a software engineer, except one, have been startups. So like from hiring manager, but also like from the candidate who's being headhunted for this role, like what kinds of things I would look for if you wanted to hire me, like what would help you hire somebody like me. I know that Hilliary and John and I, this is a topic that we spend a lot of time talking about, and I'm really excited to share like all of our thoughts with you this morning. So thank you for joining us.
Cool, thanks, you two. Yeah, like Hilliary and Frankie mentioned, this is intended to be practical, actionable advice on either if you're trying to get hired into a DC startup, or not DC startup, into a startup, or if you're a founder, especially maybe a non-technical founder who's trying to make that first hire, or trying to build out a team. So with that, I think we'll get started. We're going to kind of go through the various phases of hiring and onboarding, kind of from beginning to end. And as Corey mentioned, if you have any questions throughout, we'll be hopefully looking for some interactive bits here. So we'll be stopping, trying to answer some questions that you have. So with that, I think we'll get started with kind of the pre-hire process. So, even before you put out a job description or before you decide to hire somebody, how do you, as a founder or hiring manager, know when it's time to make that first hire? And when you're making that hire, what are some of the benefits and drawbacks? You could outsource, you could hire a junior engineer, you could hire somebody who's pretty senior. So, what goes into that decision, and how do you know when is the right time to hire somebody?
Yeah, so I think I'll sort of start from a sort of, headcount perspective of sort of like what's really needed. And especially if you're early stage and this is sort of your first hire, you have the product idea and you need someone to build it. There are a few different approaches that I think you can make, and Frankie and John as well can really talk to sort of the technical benefits or sort of drawbacks of each. But the three main areas that I think I sort of see in terms of options for that sort of first hire, you either can kind of go in-house as sort of like that hiring like a first sort of senior level engineer who's really going to set the stage sort of architecturally, but also needs to be really kind of hands-on in code too. And that's where, you're really going to kind of set the cadence. And I think that that's really important for a very product-driven organization, and especially if you're a non-technical founder, because you need a technical thought partner in the room. And hiring senior for that, I think really, is really worth the spend, in the long run. And I think, some common mistakes that I see is maybe that first hire being a bit more junior from maybe a cost saving standpoint. And that's where you're really going to probably lack some of the more sophisticated opinions or maybe more kind of the architectural sort of components of something. And that's where I see sort of in the long run maybe a problem. And I think that that's where, there could just be some drawbacks around technical debt, maybe picking the wrong technologies to start and really not knowing. And that's where, as a founder, if you're not technical, hiring someone junior who might not be that strategic thought partner in the room, I really see that as sort of a drawback. And that's if you're going sort of in-house. But I also see that if, funding is a little and you're not quite sure, or maybe the makeup of your organization is going to be more sales driven, customer experience focused, I see a lot of founders, especially from a cost saving standpoint, to kind of get a little bit more volume and bang for your buck, really thinking about options around sort of outsourcing. And I think there are benefits and drawbacks to that too. Benefits being obviously having more of a team sort of dedicated, and probably the cost will be a little bit lesser than, sort of benefits in a salary, or not especially in sort of DC or in a larger metropolitan city. But you run into the problem, I think, of where you get to a point where all of that historic knowledge and that foundational knowledge of your product is actually not in-house. And it becomes a lot harder to eventually roll off an entire outsourced team to bring it in-house. And so this is where I think about ways to kind of work smarter and not harder as it relates to sort of building out your pipeline. And Frankie, if you can kind of talk to, the benefits and drawbacks for more of a technical lens versus a people lens, I think that would be, yeah.
Yeah, I got you. We at ICX had some of these discussions over the summer. We're a pretty small team, and we weighed the benefits of whether we wanted to use contractors for price of it or not. So I can answer that part of the question first. And the answer is you have to understand what contractors are as a tool. So what they are incentivized to do is do exactly what you asked for in the shortest amount of time. They are not going to build you what I would call super sustainable software. For example, like they helped us migrate our data warehouse, and they wrote all these migration scripts that would only work for exactly the schema that it was at the beginning of that project, which is not what it is anymore. And we had to throw it all out and rewrite it. Like entire pieces of what we had asked them to do were not valuable to us anymore because they just didn't work. Whereas if an in-house team had built that, they would have built it with the thought that maybe the data schema wasn't completely finished. And they would have left some room for that, right? Because if you're the one that knows you might have to go back in here in a couple months, you're going to make different choices than if you know you're going to hand it off to somebody and be like, well, I got paid, I'm done. So if it's something that's like compact enough, I was talking to a startup, I don't know, 8 or 9 months ago, it was like a solo founder. She was like, I need to hire an engineer to build a chatbot. I've worked on the marketing side of things. I have no idea how to do this. And I advised her to outsource this because chatbot is a pretty specific piece of tech. And she's going to want someone who's done that specifically before. And because it's sort of all neatly tied up, it's easier for her to outsource like the MVP of that. And then maybe as she gets bigger, she wants to bring it in-house. But for something that needs to plug and play with the rest of your system, you might want to stay in-house. So you just have to know what contractors are when you get into that, because it's cheaper up front, but it's not always cheaper later. It's not cheaper if you have to rewrite everything that they wrote, or if large chunks just become tech debt overnight, because when you were going to start up, tech debt is everything you wrote yesterday. So it really depends whether you can tie it up in a neat little package and how well it needs to play with other things. But I also wanted to speak to John mentioned, do you hire junior, do you hire senior, do you hire whatever? And a lot of people will say that you should not hire juniors earlier in your startup career because they're not good enough. But I would actually challenge that. You don't want to hire juniors too early in your new startup because you are not prepared to support them. So it's not about whether they're good or not, because you actually don't know how good they are because they're pretty early in their career. So you don't know how good they're going to become. But if you can't spare some of a senior's time to mentor a junior or an early mid, don't hire them, because you're doing them a disservice and you're doing you a disservice. I think once you have a team of 5 seniors, you should really start to think about hiring mids, partly because how you build those seniors is to give them mentorship opportunities, and you want to make that team tolerant of asking questions and learning, rather than everybody just being like, well, we're already smart and know everything. You don't want to end up there, right? So you add you have this intergenerational engineering team as you get bigger. But if you're one of your first 5 and you're trying to raise a series round and you're just go, don't hire somebody you can't support. So that's where I think it comes into hiring just your seniors, but know that like the line between where it's okay to hire only seniors and when you should start to be tolerant of other levels will come at you fast. So like you just need to bake that into your plan. Did I get on all the salient points?
I think so. Yeah, I'll just echo a lot of that. As I was the first full-time like in-house engineering hire at my current job, and a lot of these points are I'm very I guess acutely familiar with them. There was a lot of our software had been written by contractors, and like there were benefits to that in that I was able to focus on some of the higher priority stuff. But then as time goes on, that those things become tech debt, and you have to weigh that and balance it. So I think that's awesome. And
can we explain real quick what tech debt is if they're not technical? Sure.
Yeah, technical debt is like Frankie said, it's the code you wrote yesterday. It's as you're building things, there's often a trade-off between writing something really quickly and getting it out there, or maybe building something in a more sustainable way. Like like Frankie mentioned, if you're migrating a database, if you write it very specifically for one set of database schemas, then that changes, then that becomes debt that you have to go repay. It's similar to financial debt in a lot of ways, that it's often a decision that you hopefully knowingly make that this is not the ideal decision for right now, but for the long term, we're going to have to pay this back eventually. But for now, we're making this decision so that we can either move quickly or focus on something else. So in a world of startup world has, you always have a million competing priorities, and, there's always more to be done. So it's always a decision between, do I build this the right way that, in a year or two, I'll be really happy with myself for building this, or do I build it quickly and know that I'll have to go back to it later, which on a long enough timeline, everything becomes technical debt. But that's, I think, a whole other discussion. Yes, exactly.
I want to add something to that, which is that sometimes tech debt is created not because you didn't think sustainably, or you made like a speed versus quality cutoff. Sometimes it's because part of your product pivots. Like sometimes it's not even your fault, but it's just like code that's lying around that either isn't actively in use or is not quite doing what you need it to do, that you end up having to fix. Like you should assume that all the code that you write in your first year as a startup is probably trash, and you're going to have to rewrite it later because you did it fast, right? Your priorities are different, and it's okay. I don't want anybody on this call to think like, oh my God, tech debt is something we should avoid at all costs. You can't avoid it. You're going to have tech debt. It's part of the process. So part of building a good engineering organization is having a group of people that know how to deal with that when it happens, and where they can preventing it. But like, it's by no means something that's completely avoidable.
I do have, I have a question actually, because this is sparking up a lot of stuff just as a, someone who supports hiring managers in general, especially as sort of the first founder. You mentioned something about like the product pivoting. And I feel like that happens a lot, especially in this new normal that we're into. I mean, yeah, it's pretty crazy. So as a founder who's not technical, how can they support their engineering team or engineering hire if it's in-house? I think with contractors, it's like you said, it's pretty different. How can they support their engineers when they make that business decision, product pivot? Like what is like the best practice to be like, hey, we're changing it up?
Yeah, I have argued with lots of product and business leaders at multiple companies about whether tech debt needed to be dealt with or not. And the thing is that a lot of times the non-technical, if you work at a tech company, you're a technical, like non-technical, the people that are not engineers, they often don't allow the space to either build more sustainable software because that takes a little bit more time, or to clean up the tech debt. And they actually don't have any idea how much time it's adding to what the engineers are doing every time they add a feature. You need to be able to trust and rely on your engineers that that's the case, right? Like I was at a startup like last spring in like 2019 where I was like, this is a service nobody wants to touch, and it's responsible for an integral part of what we sell as a business. It has to be rewritten. Nobody wants to do any work in it because they're afraid they're going to break everything. And it's spaghetti code. And they're like, oh no, we don't need to do that. We need to do this other thing.
Spaghetti code.
So spaghetti code is the opposite of sustainable code. You can't read it. You can't tell what it's doing. It seems to work by magic. It's like a black box, and you're like, oh. And code like that is because what happens is lots of people had their hands in the cookie jar, just adding a little bit here and there, and nobody had taken the time because the engineering culture at this particular company was a little more on the hacky side than on the sustainable side as a general rule. They were a little bit further along in their startup life, and they should have been at the point where they were considering moving to more sustainable patterns, but they weren't ready to let that go. And they ended up having to rewrite it shortly thereafter, but like it was months-long discussions about whether this needed to be done or not, all because people were not like trusting the engineers that were actually working in on the code. My current company, basically the first thing I did from day one there was I was like, you are using Elasticsearch as a big data store. And for those of you that are not technical on this call, Elasticsearch is something you use for logs where you might need to like fuzzy text search for some words. It's not a place where you put like millions and millions of records, like hundreds of millions of records of structured data. It's not appropriate for that. But so like I had months of discussions about the fact that we had the wrong tool was used for the job because we were multiple product pivots away from using Elasticsearch. It was like, it was just time. I was like, we can't build new features and also do this. So we ended up in a compromise. We were like, we're going to continue to support all of our current clients, and we're going to get this time and space on the back to be able to move that over. But like, the best way that the non-engineers in the room can support that is by listening to the engineers and like saying, these are, you know, and if there are reasons why you don't have time to do the tech debt, and it's like, well, we have to continue to serve XYZ customer because they bring in a lot of money. Like, you need to tell the engineers that, because engineers are smart and they can help you figure out how to balance that, right? And so what I did, armed with all of this information, is in a deal for a new customer, I slid in the BigQuery migration. I made it part of the work for that project. And by the time that project was done, management was like, oh yeah, of course we have to rewrite our infrastructure. And I was like,
yeah, I think you just made a really strong case for whether or not to hire junior or senior hire two, to really think about both, you know. I think it's really important, especially in any startup, to be able to pivot to think both strategically and tactically. Like, you need that macro view and like that big picture perspective. And engineering is definitely a strategic business partner, just like HR is a strategic business partner if it's the right sort of partnership and built on trust. And so, you know, I think we definitely gotten into a little bit more deeper than the pre-hire stuff, but I think, you know, both you and John have made like really, really valid points. And I think as a people partner, it's hard sometimes for us to really give that deeper level advice to a non-technical sort of founder, because I think technology changes. There's always something new and latest and exciting as well. And I see a trend of products being built that's really big data heavy, like really. And so I think that the more sophisticated of a product that you're looking to build to, I think this is where it's like, you definitely have to do kind of a cost benefit analysis, because I always say in the interviewing process, and we'll get to this in a second too, especially when we talk about diverse teams. And I put that in quotes because there's not a one size fits all or definition for diverse, but I think it's something where when you're de-risking that decision-making process and de-biasing your process overall, there's something about being a little bit uncomfortable for a little bit longer to get the bigger return on the end. And it's even waiting for the right hire, because the cost of a bad hire is exponential. It's almost, I think it's about 80% of the salary. I think that's like the actual like monetary cost in terms of productivity and sort of everything else and time wasted. And so, you know, I think as a founder, it's important to think about, you know, especially if you're a solo founder, you know, it's lonely at the top. And so who do you have in your network, in your pool, to really share ideas with? But also you have to value those ideas sort of too, because ultimately reaching that consensus and building a culture, which I think we'll get into a little bit of like, what kind of culture do you want to build in your company? I'm always a proponent of building a culture of collaboration. But also you need, especially in this remote workforce that we're in right now, in this new normal, there needs to be a blend of collaboration, but also strategic self-motivation, where I say strategic, where you don't lose sight of the fact that you are a part of a team. And so I think that from a people perspective, as a founder, or you have co-founders, it really doesn't matter. You need to be clear on the type of not only product you want to build, but the type of organization and engineering culture, just culture in general, that you want long-term, because I hate using this phrase, but people are your most valuable asset. And so, you know, and I think if you know, there are husbands in the room, you know, that happy wife, happy life sort of thing. It's something where, you know, especially if you're not technical, you know, it's something where it's like, lean on the experts in the room. I like to leverage people for their strengths, and I don't want to put round pegs in square holes. And so when you're building a diverse team, it's not just black and white, men and women, all of that fun stuff. It's really about, who do you have at that seat at the table? what different viewpoints do you have? Because that's what breeds innovation. And if you're building a product that is serving a whole different bunch of types of people, which you probably usually are, then you need as much of those different types of people at that table so that you're removing any unconscious or even conscious blind spots.
I think, going along kind of with that, I think it's really important, like Frankie said, and Hilliary also said, like to trust the people that you put into those, those seats at the table. I think part of that is like knowing that you have the right people there. Like how do you know, first of all, like what role you're trying to fill, or like what spot you're, what you need at that time, and like how do you, as someone who's not an engineer, how do you know that the people that you're bringing in are going to be able to fill that? Because you mentioned, Hilliary, the cost of a
bad hire,
incorrect hire. Yeah, bad hire is
not bad, just not the best.
Right, especially early stage startups. Like money is a thing, but time is also critical. Like if you're trying to get to market, if you set yourself back, a good bit, like that's huge. Like that's so important. So it's really, really important to get that decision correctly. You're not always going to get it correct, but so how do you know what you need, and how do you assess that properly, versus if you have a handful of engineers in the room already, the technical interview, well, just besides the fact that technical interviews are broken in a lot of ways, but it's a lot easier to assess someone's credentials or chops. How do you do that as a non-technical founder, or
Yeah, I feel like that's a good segue into the, all right, you identified your need, now what?
Yeah, so the fact is that a lot of startups, including mine right now, are moving away from having a technical interview. So if you are a non-technical founder, if you're not an engineer and you're a founder, let's put it that way, and you need to hire engineers, you don't need to be able to give them a whiteboard interview. You don't need to give them a coding challenge. In my previous life, when I was an accountant, nobody asked me to balance a bank statement as part of the interview process. Like other industries don't do that. It's sort of stupid that we do. So you don't need to be able to look at their code to know if they're good. You can leverage things like their references. What have they built that's out in the wild? Who they've worked at. Like if they've been an early stage engineer at a startup and that startup went on to raise lots of rounds of funding, like they probably know what they're doing. And you can rely on that, and you could leverage your network, because you might know, the DC startup scene is not so big that you can't like find somebody that knows somebody who can do that. I mean, so like thing A is you can leverage all these tools that you already have available. You can talk to references, you can see what work they've done. Like sometimes people will even have things that are like they build a website or they build an e-commerce thing or something, and you can literally just go try it out. The other thing is like you could hire somebody to do your engineering hiring, but I really don't think you need to do that, because probably unless like if you are a non-technical founder, my assumption is that the startup that you're running is not like some huge algorithmic something where you need a PhD in mathematics to do it.
Oh, maybe, you never know.
I mean, and if that's your need, then you should probably hire someone to help you with that level of specificity. But other than that, like you should be able to rely on all these other tools. Like Hilliary is not an engineer, but I would trust her to be able to find me an engineer, because Hilliary can assess that, because she has all of this knowledge and all of this experience. The whiteboard interview is completely unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think, so I saw we had a question, in an early stage startup, is it best to have a technical advisor to help with the selection of interviews? And so I'm not a technical advisor, and especially when I was in-house, and, throughout my career as a recruiter, I always seem to be able to avoid two things: politics and technical hiring. It just wasn't my jam. I'm a talker, I'm a people person. And, and Frankie, I actually used to do accounting and finance recruiting. And I was like, you know what, like personality. I'm like, I just like don't want to be on these calls all day. But I really realized though that, you know, a good recruiter can really recruit for anything. And the same thing with the founder. If you are very clear in terms of your values, your operating philosophies, and your vision for the product and the problem that you're looking to serve, that first hire is, you know, obviously the technical capabilities are key, but I think even more importantly is finding someone that's really in alignment and bought into your vision too, because you need that partner. And so if we're talking about like a job description to really start, and this is like not a top secret sort of thing. This is literally how people operate, hiring managers, recruiters alike, the job description, what needs to go into it. Do your research on companies that you respect or maybe are similar in your industry, or could be large players like the Twitters of, you know, the world, or the Netflix, the cultures that you really want to emulate or you admire as a founder, or those leaders. See who they have on their teams. Just do some LinkedIn searches, see what roles they have posted, and see what language in those job descriptions really resonate with what you think you really are you're trying to say. You don't have to reinvent the wheel and start things from scratch. You can come up with a short list of qualifications and responsibilities by literally copying and pasting from like other job descriptions. Like no one really creates things from scratch. We're always just reinventing the wheel and just updating it to work smarter and not harder. But the key to that description though, and what you have to be really clear in the beginning, is what your mission is, what your product is, and who you are. Because what I've noticed in technical interviewing and recruiting is that this is definitely a two-way conversation, and you're being interviewed just as much as you're interviewing that candidate. And you have to remember that, you know, your product and business isn't for everyone. And from a candidate perspective, your gift isn't meant to be shared with everyone. And I say this a lot, especially with engineers from more marginalized groups. I do a lot of work with hiring, you know, women and people of color, women of color specifically in tech. I do a lot with Women Who Code, Black Code Collective. One of my clients is Black Girls Code and Lesbians Who Tech. So I come at it from more of a candidate lens in a lot of ways, because I'm very focused on the community work that I do. And I really want to understand, you know, when I hired Frankie and John, and I'm like, you know, and they both interviewed me. And as a recruiter, I respected that, because it showed me that they were bought into the process too. And it showed me that they would be committed as well, but that they were being intentional with what they were looking for. You know, and, you know, with boot camp grads, I think you'll get a little bit of a different conversation and perspective, but I think this is where it's a benefit too, because they're less focused maybe on the product, but it doesn't matter, because it's more about getting that applicable experience. And if they're going to be set up for success in that. And I think that's really key, because as Frankie mentioned, boot camp grads have a horrible stigma. Or sometimes if you're thinking about a diverse candidate, there's that unconscious notion that you're, sacrificing quality. And that is not the case, because especially if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't know if it's going to work out or not. And that's going to be really clear. And so do your research, but as it relates to who you have in your network, you know, the people that you meet at DC Startup Week, you know, I think are really just sort of good champions. But I think, you know, leverage sort of the founder pool that you have in terms of best practices, or startups that have been successful, you know, and really saying, hey, can I pick your brain? As Frankie mentioned, you don't need to, especially in the beginning, have all of these technical assessments and codes, because if you hire strategically in the beginning and then you scale, you have that thought partner that's going to create a model and a framework for interviewing best practices that are going to work for your organization. And so from a tech hiring standpoint, you know, we have another question too. If you're a non-technical founder, how would you know if the potential employees can actually build what you need? And this is where it's just like asking for data. You need data to make informed decisions. So this is where, if they are a boot camp grad or they are more senior, then they have experience and they have examples of what they can speak to. So see what they've already done versus asking them to do something new. And if you're going to ask for them to do something new, especially when you haven't had anything built, then you're getting into free work. And this is where you need to compensate them for their time, especially if you're a little nervous. And this is where, you know, you have to make sure that this process is equitable and fair across the board. And so what we're trying to say is that in order to de-risk the process, you need more data and insights, which is where you need to be clear on the questions that you're asking. But more importantly, you have to be clear on your need and your must-haves versus nice-to-haves, and leveraging the network to really do that. When you work with staffing agencies, it's incredibly transactional. So what you're not gonna get is that advocate for your brand. I think staffing agencies are helpful when you're scaling and you need pipeline and you're having trouble. Maybe you don't have a brand that's out there yet, so you don't have a ton of people applying, and you need to just cast a wide net. But there are a ton of other resources that are out there in tools and job boards like Diversify Tech. I can't you know, recommend them enough in terms of really getting a real, like her reach. Her name is Veni Kunche. She has such a broad reach. You don't have to be married to DC. You know, you could go throughout the United States for anyone, because I think, you know, we've also seen kind of in the student world, you could work anywhere, you know, effectively. It's all just about how you communicate as an organization. And so I think this is where, you know, there has to be a level of trust where you're going to make a hire. And if you're just asking more questions and going through more of the process, and you're really just, you know, you have to take risks. And all you're really doing when you're interviewing people, you see them on their best day, you know, and it doesn't matter what brand you have. And so this is really where you have to go with your gut a lot too, but also be resilient as a founder, where if there's not alignment, you have to be quick to make decisions too. Make sure you're not rage making decisions, but you have to be quick to make those decisions too. And so I think, and this is the other question that I actually want you guys to answer, is if you're not technical and trying to build a tech company, is it better to spend your time on finding a technical co-founder, or just hire a technical person to build what you want? And I think that is, you know, as a solo founder, like, I think that's a very personal question for sure. I think of, you know, shows like Shark Tank, and like, who do you want, like, having really kind of that weight in your decision-making process overall as sort of a founder, and sort of letting that go. But I'd love to hear your guys' perspective on the benefits of just finding like a co-founder versus just, you know, maybe, you know, a head of engineering that is really making more strategic decisions about the product and supporting the business objectives, but maybe not as business or revenue driven, I guess I should say.
Yeah, it's a really, the co-founder thing is a really interesting question. And I would, if you, for anybody on this call who is like at that point where that's the decision you're making, Y Combinator has startup school videos. You can find them on YouTube. They're free. Please watch all of them related to co-founders. Because the fact is, if you choose the wrong co-founder, your business is basically guaranteed to fail.
Yeah.
The risk is much higher for you to select a co-founder that's a bad fit than a head of engineering that's a bad fit. I mean, your first engineering hire is still a big deal, but a co-founder is an even bigger deal. And some of the advice that's really stuck with me from like all the Y Combinator stuff, right, which is a company that spits out a lot of startups. They've got this down to some kind of a science. It should be somebody you already know. You should already have a history with them. Because for the same reason that we want to build trust inside our engineering teams, right? So when the going gets tough, you have a foundation from which to be able to work with them and not have your first friend fight, professional fight, like blow up your business. Whereas if you hire a head of engineering, they function in sort of an advisory capacity to you where they can give you advice, but the end decision is still yours. So there's an element of what control you're giving up. Also like how close, you know, I think for most people, like if you have a pretty clear vision, you're probably looking at more of like a head of engineering role than like a co-founder. It's not that you can't find a co-founder, but that I think that search is more difficult. You're also expecting people to buy in a little bit more, whereas like if head of engineering, that's a job. Co-founder is like, I don't want to say it becomes your identity, but it sort of becomes your identity.
yeah, I think they're all big commitments, but I think it just adds a different layer to it. But I also think too, and I know this question kind of comes up a lot of like, well, how will I know if this is the right person? How do I know if what they're saying actually like makes sense? You don't really know, really, unless you really try it out. But as a part of the interview process too, especially if you decide that you really want to bring more of that strategic partner to the table. One of the questions that I really kind of lean on, or the types of questions that I lean on when I'm interviewing outside of the technical piece, because to me, I'm like, why would you apply for a job or entertain a conversation that you really can't do? And I don't say no to opportunities on anyone's behalf, but I do my best to really lay out the foundation. I am radically transparent and candid with what I do. And if I scare you away, great, because I want decisions to be informed either way. And I think as a founder, when you're having conversations with technical leads, I think the biggest thing is going back to making sure and asking them questions that are really more focused on strategy, I think, and kind of big picture, because you know, I think it's easy to find strong individual contributors, but the hardest gap for any human is making that pivot between tactical and strategic. And so I would make the questions more about big picture, short-term and long-term, and see if that person has that capability to be able to think high level, because that's also de-risking the product development process overall, and tech debt and all the other things that we were talking about, and the types of technology to use to do that. Senior means opinion. Ultimately, you're confident in making an opinion and a recommendation. It could be the wrong one, but you're confident enough to have information to make that recommendation. And that's really the difference. So when you're interviewing, interview more for how they think through problems, how they think both big picture and small. Ask them their management style, how they can manage up versus, you know, ask those questions more around how you guys will work together. I take a very human-centered, human design approach to the work that I do. And so it's really making sure you add that human component to it, as opposed to, you know, being incredibly transactional of like, you work for me, when it really should just be, yeah, I cut your paycheck, but this is a partnership. Because everyone, especially when you're this early on, should have a seat at that table. Question is, at what point when sharing the insights of your vision should you use or not use an NDA? I think the first conversation, you know, especially if you are advertising your job, you need to have just a high level company description. You know, you need to be able to talk about your idea, you know, and if you're advertising it, you know, just have a really strong summary out there. You don't have to go into the ways that you're going about it, but you should have a mission statement. And I think after you have that initial call, which should be reiterating your mission statement, talking about you individually, like who you are as a founder, what's important to you, and then hearing from them what's important to them when assessing a new opportunity, how they operate, what they're looking for to get them excited. And then once you have that initial conversation, you know, you're kind of, it's like you're dating, you kind of had that initial, like, you know, that initial chat, and you're like, okay, we're going to meet. When you dive deeper, that's when the NDA, I think, is reasonable, because then you've established that mutual interest to go deeper. You don't want to lead with an NDA because you're blocking, you're limiting your pipeline even more. You need to have conversations, but you need to be confident enough in your mission statement. You don't have to go through all the nooks and crannies. You know, this is something where it's like, but you have to be clear on who you are and why someone would work for you. And so this is where I would just talk how much or how little you really want. It really just depends on the product that you're looking to build. But I think the NDA should come after you've established, okay, this is worth exploring a little bit more. Then you have a deeper dive. And also make sure your interview process doesn't have like 17 rounds. You know, just be really clear. Just make sure you're asking the right questions. And I'll actually put this in the chat too. I have put together quite a few interview sort of best practices, sort of tips and tricks. I'm gonna put my website on here where I've like literally put together a list of questions that you can literally select from on like each like behavioral sort of outline. And it's something where it's like, you just have to know what you're looking for, and don't start interviewing until you're at least clear on like, this is what I think I need. Don't just start having conversations just for the sake of it, because you're wasting everyone's time.
Yeah, and I think one really important piece there is that, Hilary mentioned it earlier, like when you're hiring, even whether you're thinking about a co-founder, or whether you're thinking about your first engineer, whether you're thinking about anybody really, as a founder, you're selling somebody on a vision, you're selling somebody on your company. It's similar in a lot of ways to meeting with a VC. They're interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing them. So you have to make it interesting and intriguing to them. So leading up front with like an NDA or something like that, almost it'll shut the door on a lot of people. And I think it really is. You have to have people bought in, because it's a lot different than a later stage, maybe stable place where you can hire somebody who it's much more transactional. Maybe they are still bought in, but early stage, there's going to be a lot of pivots. There's going to be a lot of times where you have to do some really hard work, and you have to really be bought in on the vision and that mission in order to be able to push through those really difficult parts. So,
and correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I also think it's important to, with these initial conversations, to not only be clear on the vision, but also be clear on what level of responsibility, autonomy, and ownership that this new hire will have. Because I think if you're enticing them to especially leave something that they're probably comfortable at, for me, I think, what I've seen, especially if we're thinking about sort of the millennial and Gen Z population, sometimes it's less about compensation and more about what's the growth potential, what's the opportunity, what am I gonna be able to do differently than I'm doing right now? What are those? And so I think that that's where you can lead with what that opportunity is really going to look like from a development lens, and less focused on the nooks and crannies of the technical piece. Because for your first hire, like I said, they're not going to have the conversations if they don't think they can do it. And usually if they're experienced, they have receipts. So instead of having them reinvent the wheel, just ask them for a portfolio or examples of what they've done in the past. And then you decide how you feel about that, because you're not going to know if you're not technical. And so this is where it's like, you also have to remember too that, job descriptions and interviewing, like this whole process is broken, and it doesn't work for a lot of the marginalized communities too. And so if you're really looking to be intentional with building a diverse team, especially in a healthy culture, you have to be very clear on the humans, the types of humans that you want to work with, that you can work with, and be very clear on any biases that you might have. It's very easy to hire someone you know and you're comfortable with, but that doesn't mean that that's the best hire for you, because you're just surrounding yourself with people that are going to agree with you. And you're not going to get anything innovative like that. But you also should be open to that feedback and ideas. And if you're just shut off, or if you're just saying no without providing any context really, then you're not going to build a sustainable company long term. You just might as well just become an engineer at that point and just sort of do it yourself.
Yeah, and I think as we come up on time here, I think I would like to kind of frame one last question combined with, we had a question earlier that I think kind of skipped over. It was about how do you know when it's the time to move from getting things done quickly and maybe accumulating a lot of that technical debt that we mentioned versus moving to a more sustainable organization. And I think in addition to that, I think I would like to kind of combine that with once you've brought on that hire, once you've brought on your first, engineer, or you've brought on a co-founder, or you've brought on somebody who's going to really make your vision a reality, how do you set them up for success, and how do you trust them with those types of decisions, but also hold them accountable to make sure that the work's actually getting done? And I think I want to throw that question over to Frankie, as someone who has done the both the individual contributor route, is also currently in a management route where she's responsible for a lot of those strategic tactical type decisions.
Yeah. So I like to say that working at a startup is asking yourself, is this a normal amount of pain every day? Like, things are hard. You're trying to build a business from scratch. Most startups fail. Like, what you're doing is difficult. And where you need to make that decision between getting things done and building more sustainable code is when the amount of pain you feel and writing new code becomes excessive. And where that line is going to be different for everybody. But the tech debt starts to become a real problem when it's literally hindering your progress. When you first start and you're building your MVP and you're getting ready to raise rounds of funding, like sometimes you are just throwing some shit on the wall and seeing what sticks. And that's totally valid for where you're at. You know, and then you build more and you build more and you're like, oh, you're really excited. And then you get to a point where you're like, wow, that's going to take 3 times longer than I thought it was because of all this other junk. That's when it's time to pause. And you probably don't have time to do it all at once, but your engineering team or your engineer needs to have like an understanding of what is necessary to make that code more sustainable. It's been my experience that a lot of startup engineers tend to fall into one of 2 camps in terms of their preference for how they write code. There are a lot of engineers out here that prefer to write hacky code. They just want it to work. They want to get it out the door. And I fall into the second camp, which is where like, I will take every extra opportunity that you give me to make sure that this code is sustainable for next time. Probably because I used to be an accountant and I like things to be tight. And so like, if I have the extra time, I will sit, to get an entire organization doing that, you need to have decided on some standards. I mean, you go with like clean architecture is a good baseline. Like, I don't think you should take everything in the clean architecture book and be like, this is exactly what we should do. Also, Uncle Bob is a menace. I don't know if there are engineers on here who know who he is, but he's a toad. And so like take some architectural pattern and just like everybody get on board with it. And then that will allow you to turn over pieces of software as you interact with them, rather than trying to go through and do it all at once. In an ideal world, you want all your code to look like it was written by one person, right? I don't want to be able to tell who wrote that by the style. Everybody's style should be the same because it makes the code easier to maintain and easier to read later. But you're not going to be able to do that all at once. So you just sort of decide what those rules are, and then like as you work on things, you make changes. And if you are lucky enough to have like a sales or a product team that's like, yeah, take the next 3 months, just rewrite the whole thing. No worries, we won't give you new work. Like, great. That's a dream come true for engineers. Take it, but that's not reality. You're going to have to serve your current clients. You're going to have to continue to build new features or whatever is necessary to continue to raise your funding, or whatever it is you're doing, because ultimately we're all here to make money. And like resolving tech debt will help you make money, but very indirectly. So you have to do the things that directly help you make money along the way. So you do it in pieces. You decide your base pattern and then you do it in pieces. But the when is when it starts to feel, when your engineers are like, I need 2 months to do that. And you're like, this is just like, we're just going to add a button somewhere, And they're like, no, I need 2 months. Like, okay, we should take a step back and think about this. Yeah. It's all about pain threshold.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end it on. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank Hilliary and Frankie for all of the awesome and amazing advice. And happy rest of your Friday.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Hilliary and Frankie, for bringing your perspectives to this fantastic discussion on building a diverse tech team. I know I learned so much, and I'm not even a technical founder or building any kind of technology, so I can't imagine what everyone else that came to the event learned as well. Just want to mention at 10 a.m. here, we've got Turning Profits into Purpose in Times of Crisis, part 2. So there's a current panel going on, some really great conversations in there. And then we also have the CEO's new framework on employee engagement, retention, and culture. So some fantastic conversations happening. Would love to see you guys in those sessions. And then here at 1 p.m., we have our weekly coffee check-in and mastermind. This is a weekly event that we do every week for DC Startup Week, where we have a little coffee chat, but it's really great. We can all come in, share resources and connect with each other and get to know some of your fellow entrepreneurs. So we'd love to see you guys in that. And then right after that at 2 p.m., we have our pitch competition finals, our culminating event. So thank you all so much for joining, and we'll see you guys soon.